the sound of chairs scraping against marble floors. That is what the end of an era sounds like. Not an explosion, not a declaration of war, not a breaking news alert about missiles or casualties. Just the quiet, deliberate sound of diplomats standing up, gathering their papers, and walking out of a room while the American ambassador was still speaking. 14 nations. At the United Nations Security Council, in New York City, the symbolic heart of American-led global order. And the question that should stop you cold is this: how does the most powerful country in the history of the world end up sitting alone in that room, talking to empty chairs? That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the operational reality of American foreign policy as of Tuesday, March 10th, 2026. And to understand how we arrived at this moment, we have to go back further than last week. We have to go back to the assumption that made this crisis inevitable. For more than 3 decades, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, American foreign policy has rested on a foundational belief. The belief that when Washington acts, the world follows. That American power is so overwhelming, so essential to global stability, that other nations have no real choice but to align with it, even when they disagree. That belief was not arrogance for its own sake. It was, for a long time, an accurate reading of how the world worked. America built the institutions, funded the alliances, guaranteed the trade routes, and kept the peace in ways that made it indispensable. The architecture of post-war global order ran through Washington, and for decades, that architecture held. What we are watching right now is that architecture cracking in real time, and the man standing at the center of the collapse, unable to stop it, is the same man who promised it would never happen. 42 days before the Security Council walkout, Donald Trump stood in the Rose Garden and announced what his team described as the most decisive military strategy in American history. The plan was called maximum shock deployment. The logic was brutally simple: hit Iran hard enough, fast enough, and with enough economic pressure that the regime would have no choice but to surrender within days. The timeline given to congressional leaders was 7 to 10 days from the first strike to a signed agreement. Stage 1 was simultaneous military strikes on command centers across Iran. Stage 2 was a complete naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, at the narrow channel through which roughly 18 million barrels of oil pass every single day. Stage 3 was back-channel negotiation, where Iranian leaders, strangled economically and humiliated militarily, would accept American terms because they had run out of options. Trump told Fox News, and these are his words, "Iran will be begging us for a deal by the weekend. They cannot survive what we are about to do to them." That statement is worth pausing on, not because it was unusual for Trump's style of rhetoric, but because it reveals the central assumption buried inside the entire strategy. The assumption that pain creates compliance, that if you apply enough pressure, any adversary will eventually fold. It is a theory of power that has a certain intuitive logic, and it is a theory that has failed, repeatedly, against adversaries who have learned to read American domestic politics as carefully as American generals read battlefield maps. Before a single strike was launched, the warnings were already coming in. European allies told the administration directly that unilateral military action without United Nations authorization would fracture NATO cooperation. Japan and South Korea, whose economies are deeply dependent on Persian Gulf energy, warned that a Hormuz blockade would devastate their industries, and they could not support it. Gulf state partners communicated privately that they would not allow their military bases to be used for regime change operations. These were not the protests of weak nations looking for an excuse to avoid commitment. And these were strategic assessments from countries that had stood with Washington through decades of difficult decisions. Trump's team dismissed every objection. National Security Advisor Stephen Miller told a closed-door Senate briefing, "They will fall in line once they see Iran collapse. Everyone loves a winner." Secretary of State Marco Rubio assured business leaders that markets would rally once Iran capitulated. The message from the White House was consistent and confident. Trust the plan. The pain will be decisive. The allies will follow once they see results. That confidence began to dissolve on the morning of Monday, March 9th, 2026. At 6:23 in the morning Eastern Time, Donald Trump received a phone call from the French president. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. According to leaks from two separate sources inside the National Security Council, the French leader did not call to discuss strategy. He did not ask for Trump's position. He informed Trump that France was withdrawing from all joint military operations related to Iran and would be sponsoring a United Nations Security Council resolution condemning the Hormuz blockade as a violation of international maritime law. Trump reportedly shouted into the phone that France was making the biggest mistake in its history. The French president ended the call. While that exchange was happening, Germany was issuing a nearly identical statement. And while Germany's statement was being released, Japan announced it would be permanently rerouting its energy imports away from the Persian Gulf, canceling contracts worth billions of dollars that had depended on American security guarantees. In the span of a single morning, the diplomatic architecture that the administration had assumed would hold was coming apart across multiple continents simultaneously. Then the markets opened. At 9:15 in the morning, the Dow Jones Industrial Average opened down 847 points. Not because of Iranian military capabilities, not because of specific battlefield developments, because Goldman Sachs released a research note with a title that would have been unthinkable a decade ago: Diplomatic Isolation Premium. The note explained that American credibility had become a market risk factor, that investors were now pricing in the possibility that allied nations were making independent decisions that contradicted American strategy. By 10:30 that morning, the drop had reached 1,143 points. At the same time, Trump was in the Oval Office on a call with the Saudi Crown Prince. Sources in the room described the president as visibly agitated, pacing behind the resolute desk. The Crown Prince, according to a leaked transcript, told Trump that Saudi Arabia could not support further military escalation and was already in direct talks with Iran about regional dialogue. Trump responded, "After everything we have done for you, this is how you repay us." The Crown Prince's reply, again from the leaked transcript: "Mr. President, you did not consult us before starting this. We are now consulting ourselves on how to end it." The call ended. Trump, according to sources, threw his phone across the room. It shattered against the wall near the fireplace. And there is something analytically important in that image. Not the anger itself, which is a human response to an overwhelming situation, but what the anger reveals. A president who had built a strategy on the expectation that others would cooperate, now confronting the reality that cooperation is earned, not commanded. That America's relationships with its partners are not unconditional. That those partners have their own populations, their own economies, their own calculations about survival. The afternoon of March 9th delivered the moment that crystallized the entire crisis. Iran's foreign minister appeared simultaneously on Al Jazeera, CNN International, and BBC. He was composed. He had clearly prepared carefully. And he delivered a statement that the White House still has not found an effective response to. And he said that the United States had offered Iran a ceasefire 3 times in the previous 2 weeks. Each time, conditions were attached that would require Iran to surrender sovereignty. Each time, the American side leaked to media that an agreement was close to make themselves appear strong. Each time, Iran clarified publicly that they had agreed to nothing. Then he said the line that has been playing on news networks around the world. President Trump can call this a peace offer. The world sees it for what it is: desperation. That word, delivered calmly, before cameras, with 14 empty chairs as backdrop, landed with more force than any military strike could have produced. Because it was credible. Because the evidence for it was visible to anyone watching. That same evening, at 9 o'clock, a crisis meeting took place in the White House Situation Room. The participants included Trump, Rubio, Defense Secretary Ron DeSantis, Miller, and General Charles Brown, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 3 separate sources confirmed the same essential exchange. General Brown opened with a military assessment. The Hormuz blockade was sustainable for another 3 weeks before logistics became critical. Iranian retaliatory strikes had damaged 2 American destroyers and killed 19 service members. Targets in Bahrain and Kuwait, which were supposed to be protected by American air defense systems, had been hit. Trump's first question was direct. Are we winning or not? General Brown paused before answering. Mr. President, Iran has not collapsed. Their leadership is still in place. Their military is still operational. And they are striking our positions with increasing accuracy. When Miller argued they were on the verge of breaking and simply needed more pressure, Rubio responded with a tone described by sources as measured but firm. He told the president they had a diplomatic problem that was becoming a strategic crisis. France, Germany, Japan, and South Korea had all broken publicly. The Saudis were hedging. The UAE was in direct talks with Tehran. When Rubio called counterparts in European capitals, half of them would not take his calls anymore. Trump responded that America didn't need them, that it had never needed them. Rubio's reply, according to sources, was the clearest statement of operational reality delivered in that room. Sir, the reason Iran is not negotiating is because they see our allies abandoning us. They think they can wait us out. And based on what I am seeing, they might be right. The room went silent. That silence is itself significant. It is the sound of a strategy running out of answers. DeSantis outlined the military options. Escalation was possible. More strikes inside Iran. Special forces operations, targeting leadership, potentially ground troops. But he was direct about the risk. Without Allied support, without international legal cover, any of those moves could trigger a regional war pulling in actors the United States could not control. Miller argued for doubling down, making the pressure so intense that Iran would have no choice. General Brown's response was 4 words. That has been the strategy for 6 weeks. It has not worked. It was not insubordination. And it was a professional military officer stating operational reality to a commander-in-chief who had asked for an honest assessment. But in that moment, something shifted. Trump had just heard his own generals tell him the plan had failed. The meeting ended at 11:17 at night. No new strategy was announced. No decisions were made. Trump left the room first. Miller followed. The rest remained in the Situation Room for another 40 minutes, discussing contingencies without the president present. To understand this crisis structurally rather than just narratively, you have to follow the incentives of every actor involved. Iran is not behaving irrationally. They are a regional power with a sophisticated reading of American domestic politics and a very clear memory of recent history. And they watched Trump apply maximum pressure to North Korea and Venezuela. They observed that when maximum pressure is applied without meaningful diplomatic off-ramps, the result is stalemate, not surrender. They learned that if you can absorb the pain long enough, American political dynamics turn against the president faster than the target country collapses. Iran did the math. Trump's approval rating had dropped 11 points since the conflict began. Polling showed 61% of Americans believed the Iran operation was a mistake. Republican senators from competitive states were beginning to publicly distance themselves from the administration's position. Iran concluded with considerable evidence to support the conclusion that time was on their side. European allies made a separate but equally rational calculation, and France and Germany were facing energy crises because of the Hormuz blockade. Their economies were being damaged by a conflict they had no voice in starting. When Trump demanded they endorse the blockade, they faced a choice between American friendship and their own economic survival. They chose survival, and once they broke publicly, it gave every other uncertain ally the diplomatic cover to do the same. This is how power actually fractures, not in a single dramatic moment of betrayal. In a cascade of individual calculations, each one rational from the perspective of the actor making it, each one nudging the overall structure closer to collapse. The legal dimension is adding another layer of pressure. The House Foreign Affairs Committee announced it is launching an investigation into whether the Hormuz blockade violates the War Powers Resolution, since Congress never formally authorized military action against Iran. Constitutional scholars from both parties have stated publicly that a naval blockade constitutes an act of war under international law and requires congressional approval. Critically, this is not opposition party theater. The ranking Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee said publicly, "I did not vote to close the Strait of Hormuz. The American people did not vote for that. And if we are going to do something this significant, Congress needs to have a say." When a senior Republican senator makes that statement on Fox News, it signals something beyond routine political friction. It signals that the institutional guardrails of American governance are beginning to engage. Consider the chain reaction that follows from here. If the Hormuz blockade remains in place, energy markets stay destabilized. If energy markets stay destabilized, inflation accelerates. If inflation accelerates, the Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice between raising interest rates during a geopolitical crisis or allowing prices to spiral. Either path damages economic growth. If growth slows going into an election year, Republican senators in competitive races begin breaking with the administration publicly to protect their own seats. China observes all of this. Beijing sees American allies refusing to support Washington, European powers making independent security decisions, and a fracturing of the consensus that has structured global order since the Cold War. They are calculating how much room that fracture opens up in the South China Sea, in Taiwan policy, in trade negotiations. Russia is watching the same indicators. The consequences for ordinary people are already measurable and immediate. Gas prices are projected to reach $5 per gallon nationally by April, with some markets seeing $6 or higher. Shipping costs have increased 34% since the blockade began, as cargo vessels reroute around Africa rather than through the Suez Canal, adding 2 weeks to delivery times and thousands in fuel costs per container. Those costs pass directly to consumers. Food price inflation, which had been stabilizing, is now projected to spike again by 6 to 9% over the next quarter. The S&P 500 is down 14% since the conflict began. For anyone with a retirement account, that is not an abstraction, and some of these changes will not reverse when the immediate crisis ends. When European nations build new energy partnerships that do not depend on American security guarantees, those partnerships persist. When Asian economies restructure their trade relationships to reduce dependence on any single power, that restructuring becomes the new normal. When companies redesign supply chains around a world in which American diplomatic stability can no longer be assumed, they do not go back. The architecture gets rebuilt without Washington at the center. Three realistic scenarios emerge from this point. In the first, political and economic pressure forces a retreat. Congress, markets, military leadership, and Republican senators facing difficult elections compelled Trump to reopen Hormuz and abandon the demand for regime change. He declares victory anyway, claiming Iran was severely weakened. Iran accepts a face-saving agreement that changes nothing fundamental. Both sides claim they won. But the world watched America's allies walk out. The world watched Trump threaten consequences he could not deliver. That perception of weakness becomes the operating reality in every future negotiation. Credibility, once lost in this way, does not return through declarations that nothing happened. In the second scenario, unable to accept a visible diplomatic defeat, Trump orders direct strikes on Iranian leadership compounds. Special Forces operations begin. The regional war that every analyst warned about materializes. Iran strikes Saudi oil infrastructure, American bases across the Middle East, commercial shipping worldwide. Oil reaches $200 per barrel. The global economy contracts sharply. American soldiers die in a conflict with no clear exit strategy and no international support. And the constitutional crisis over war powers becomes unavoidable. In the third scenario, neither side escalates dramatically and neither side backs down. The blockade continues. Strikes and counterstrikes continue. Diplomatic isolation deepens. American allies formalize their distance, creating new security arrangements that exclude American leadership. Gulf states negotiate a separate peace with Iran, cutting Washington out entirely. China and Russia expand their influence in the space left by American diplomatic failure. America remains the most powerful military on Earth, but is no longer the organizing principle of global order. The unipolar moment ends not with a decisive defeat, but with allies quietly walking away and building something new without asking for permission. The UN walkout was not a dramatic gesture. It was a signal. It represented something specific and historically significant: the death of the assumption that when America acts, the world follows. That assumption organized international relations for 30 years. And it is not dying because America became weaker in any absolute military sense. It is dying because the world has changed in ways that make unilateral American action insufficient to produce the outcomes American strategy requires. Iran understood this before Washington did. And they rejected the ceasefire not because they believe they are winning militarily. They rejected it because they calculated, with careful attention to American political data, that Washington would fracture before Tehran would. They watched the polls, the senators, the Europeans' statements, and the market numbers. And they concluded that patience was the most powerful weapon available to them. Trump wanted maximum shock that would force instant surrender. He produced maximum isolation that makes any resolution increasingly difficult to reach. Here is the question that sits at the center of all of this, and it deserves to be asked directly and without drama. When a president loses the visible support of allied nations, the stated confidence of financial markets, and the unified backing of his own political party, all during an active military conflict he initiated, what options remain? Not in terms of tactics or statements or news cycles, but in terms of the actual levers of power that produce real outcomes in the world. The answer to that question is not simple, and anyone offering a simple answer is probably not thinking carefully enough. But the asking of it matters, because the architecture of American influence that is currently fracturing was built over decades by people who understood that military power alone does not produce lasting outcomes, that alliances are not simply convenient arrangements, but structural elements of the ability to project power credibly. That credibility, once damaged in the eyes of both adversaries and partners, changes the strategic landscape in ways that persist long after specific crises are resolved. What replaces the assumption of American dominance when that assumption stops functioning as the organizing principle of global order? When countries that have relied on American security guarantees start asking that question seriously and building alternative answers, the world that emerges from those answers will look fundamentally different from the one we have known. Iran is waiting. Its foreign minister gave his answer calmly, on 3 networks simultaneously, with 14 empty chairs as his backdrop. The world is deciding what it means, and the question that will define the next chapter of this story, the question that no one has yet found an answer to, is whether the damage to American credibility that these weeks have produced is the kind that can be repaired, or the kind that simply becomes the new reality that everyone learns to navigate around. That is not a question that gets answered in a single news cycle. It may not get answered in a single presidency. But it is the question that every diplomat, every market analyst, every military strategist, and every voter in a country affected by American power is now asking. And the fact that they are asking it in the first place may be the most significant development of this entire crisis.